All right, I hope everyone is doing well this semester. This is going to be the first lesson for the class on Joshua, Judges, and Ruth on the historical books. These are technically the first three historical books of a part of 12 historical books, seven of which are considered pre-exilic, and then 12 overall that are considered the historical books, the rest being post-exilic, meaning after the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BD, in the historical accounts of what happens to Israel. So we're going to focus on these three of the historical books, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And for this first lesson, we're going to focus on the fact that all of these books are written as history and written in a form of history known as historiography. And as I have here on the screen, that we do not have histories, we only have historians. And historiography is directly connected to the method used by the historian, much more than the actual event in and of itself, which we'll explore more later as we talk about the nature of historical writing and events. So on this page, I have the actual textbook that we're going to be using for the class, the Understanding the Bible Commentary series. We're going to use the Joshua, Judges, and Ruth volume from that series. And so here we are in week one. Once again, we're going to talk about historiography. And we're going to try to address three questions, though two of them are going to flow together. And I'm going to just do a basic preliminary kind of discussion of these. As first, we're going to talk about what historiography is. I'm going to give you kind of a working definition for historiography and how history writers develop historiography. And then I'm going to talk to you about how this affects how we should read the Bible. So why in the world is this important for how we read the historical books in the Old Testament? And then I'm just going to kind of give you a basic chronology of the events of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, the three books that we're going to talk about, and give you pretty much some of the debates that happen in regard to when these events actually occurred and the chronology that we use today. So, in regards to historiography, one of the scholars I enjoy relying upon is named David M. Howard, and he has a very good article in a book called Giving the Sense, Understanding, and Using the Old Testament Historical Text. And in his article, known as History, he gives the following definition of historiography. He's just going to say very basically, and I'm going to give you a broader definition later. Historiography is the writing of history. That's pretty much the basic definition of it. But then he's going to go on to say, thus, historical writing is a record or representation of the events, not the events themselves. And that's key here. We do not just have a recollection of the event as it happened. So I cannot just go back in time and have you live out the event, because in a sense you'd pick up way too many details if you did that. So you just know the temperature, you'd know exactly how many times the person was breathing. Who was surrounding the person. How many insects were there. How many leaves of grass. All of those sorts of things would be possible. It'd almost be like going into a virtual reality. But we can't do that for history. And to be honest, I don't know that we would want to, because you still have to interpret all of that raw data. So instead, what we have in historiography is an interpretation of the historical event. So it's not the event itself, it's an interpretation of the event in a written form. So just like the example that Howard is going to use here, a picture of an apple, regardless of how realistic it presents the apple, is not an apple. It cannot be eaten. So you can have a picture of an apple and it can explain or make the apple look beautiful and wonderful, or it can make it look grotesque and you don't want anything to do with the apple. Maybe it's got poison on it. And you can have different pictorial representations of an apple, but you can't eat it because it's not really the apple. So rather, it is a representation of the apple. So it is with historical events and historical writing. What we study are the records of the events, not the events themselves. So from here, it's important to understand that there are two types of historical writings. You have what is known as casual history and what is known as deliberate history. Casual history consists of just the raw materials, such as grave inscriptions, gravestone inscriptions, petty receipts, and letters. Those are things of casual history that you can look at, read, and then you have to try to kind of piece together what's happening. You have to interpret that information, because a pot does not just interpret itself. A gravestone, even if it has something written on it, does not just interpret itself. You have to interpret, okay, someone died. This grave was put here, and then based on the name, who this person is, or their level of importance, or why it is that they were buried in that particular spot instead of anywhere else. Instead, in contrast to that, historiography is deliberate history. So deliberate history is the product of selection by an author, building upon casual history with specific purposes in mind, creatively arranging the final product. So deliberate history is when someone is trying to tell you about a gravestone and why it's important. So once again, and I'll give plenty of examples of this throughout the lecture, if I just have a gravestone and it says Dr. Lindo, okay, there's plenty of doctors in the world. There's plenty of Lindos in the world. There's not a lot of us, so you'd be able to narrow it down and whatnot. Then it's okay. Is this the doctorate who has an Old Testament degree, or is this a doctorate in something else? There's all kinds of other things happening there. Versus if it's a gravestone that's in the backyard of my house, and you're trying to explain why it is that my family decided to bury me in the back of the house, then that's becoming deliberate because potentially there's some reason for that, and I'm telling you what that reason is, and that is an author trying to deliberately give you the history and why it's important that you found this gravestone. All right, so once again, here would be two examples of casual history and of deliberate history. So on the left here, you have an inscription with a lion on it, and it's written in Paleo Hebrew, and it says belonging to Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. So we know from other places, well, let me just say it this way. So the casual history, the seal itself doesn't really tell you anything. It's got a lion seal on it. So you might associate that with Judah, but you would have to know something about Judah already to make that association. You don't know who Shema is. You know the Lamed at the beginning, if you knew Hebrew, that belongs to Shema. And then okay, this person is a servant of Jeroboam, so Jeroboam must be someone more important. Now, if you have the biblical text, which is on the right here, and you actually know the stories of what happened in the book of Kings, okay, Jeroboam was a king of Judah, and that's perhaps why there's the lion here, because that would have potentially been the symbol for his kingship, or the coin that he wanted to use. And so now you know that he is from Judah. The lion represents Judah. Jeroboam was a king, so this must have been one of the servants of Jeroboam. And you would also know from the biblical text that it's Jeroboam the first or Jeroboam the second. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you would not know what to do with the casual history if you did not have some deliberate history backing it up. So it is better for us that we have deliberate history and Scripture than just casual history, because casual history in and of itself needs to be interpreted for us to understand what to do with that history. So now we can go a little deeper here and actually look at an example from the text of Scripture itself, where we could break that verse down technically into casual and deliberate history. So if you read Genesis 13, verses 12 through 13, you can read in verse 12, Abraham lived in the land of Canaan. Lot lived in the cities of the plain. That is, he pitched his tent near Sodom. Well, even though that is deliberate, trying to explain to you what is happening here, you could also argue that it's just casual. It's just giving us kind of raw facts. Now, you can theologically try to interpret why those facts are important, and that's something we need to do when we're reading the biblical text, and we'll explore some of that later. But overall, that's just kind of is. That's the information. But then you get something much more deliberate. So then in verse 13, also the men of Sodom were wicked and sinning before the Lord excessively. So the connection you're supposed to make here is that Lot, pitching his tent near Sodom, is pitching his tent near the people who are wicked and sinful. That's the deliberate point. That's very clear on the surface that the author is trying to make from this text. So they gave you that background information. They said that Abraham and Lot are separated. That's most important there. Knowing exactly where Canaan is, knowing exactly where Sodom is not the author's point. though potentially you could try to figure out where they are, and potentially they're relatively, close together, because it's not as if Lot had to travel for years or something to move away from Abraham. Some of that you can infer. However, the main point here is that they're separated, and their separation was not necessarily a good thing, because for Lot, he ended up living amongst people who were sinners and sinning against the Lord and were wicked and did not care. They did this excessively. So therefore, that's the deliberate point that the author is trying to make out of this, and leading you somewhat from some sort of casual history. Because remember, casual history doesn't have to just be something that's not written. So like on a gravestone, you could have, here lies Dr. Lindo, father of four. That would still be somewhat casual history, because it's not really telling you what to do with that information, compared to deliberate history actually trying to tell you this is what the author, the person who wrote it, wants you to get out of it. So if you want us to do more study on this, one book that I would recommend is a book by Leland Ryken. It's a very short book, and it's got a lot of examples of kind of how to go about investigating historiography and looking at plot and structure and setting and all of those things and characterization within a biblical text. And it's a very, very short read. It's probably about 100 pages or so. But it's called How Bible Stories Work, and he gives you a guide to do that through the biblical narrative. And here's kind of what he has to say related to this. He's going to say the biblical writers were preoccupied with history, and they overwhelmingly wanted us to know what actually happened. To record what happens is to tell a story. The narrative quality of the Bible is part of its truthfulness. So just because it's a story doesn't mean it's not truthful. Once again, it's just a deliberate story. You have to then infer whether this person is telling you a story and they're trying to tell you what happened, the truth, or they're trying to bend the facts, which is a part of a different discussion. But that in and of itself does not make it biased, just because they're trying to tell you what to do with the history that they have found. So then he goes on to say, the history recorded in the Bible exists in a continuum of literary analysis, which is the same thing as saying scribal composition, which we may talk about some this semester, or we may not, is only a part. On one end of the continuum, we find the impulse to record the facts of what occurred. Nothing more. That's, once again, casual history. On the literary end of the spectrum, we find events, setting, and characters presented in full detail with artistry, so that we relive the story in our imaginations and relish in the storyteller's skill. That's deliberate history. So history has a sort of spectrum, and it can be more deliberate or more casual, but that takes place in any sort of narrative story. So this is how I would summarize biblical historiography. The biblical texts contain both historical and theological information. This information was written by the hands of men, but that does not negate its ability to speak of earthly matters under divine guidance. That's how I would detailedly and articulate what biblical historiography is. All right, so now we'll spend some time talking about just the basic chronology of these historical books, the pre-exilic ones, once again, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. So the most common chronology, still followed today by especially more conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist sort of groups, is going to be one that was produced by Archbishop James Ussher. And he did this in 1650, and the first volume, and the second volume came out in 1654. So pretty much he's going to give this sort of chronology, and he would have the viewpoint that the earth is only about 6,000 years old, kind of at the time of his writing, roughly, 4,000 years before Christ, 2,000 years since Christ has come. So he's going to say, okay, about 1451 is when the Israelites entered the Promised Land. And then it took about, 6 years for Joshua to divide the lands after they had kind of conquered it. And then the land was kind of at rest there for a few years. And then Joshua dies in 1426. And he's going to say Israel fell into idolatry after his death. And then Cusham is the first one who comes and dominates Israel before kind of the judges start. So then he's going to give kind of the main view of most people, especially once again more conservative scholars, that it was about 300 years that the judges reigned. So the first judge, Othniel, is going to be in 1405, and the last judge, Samuel, is going to be in 1116 BC. And so then, different events happen between them. The Benjamin tribe is going to get destroyed. Gideon was offered the kingship and rejected it. And then he's also going to say Ruth met Boaz roughly a year before Samuel was born. And we're going to look at some of those chronological factors when we look at kind of the book of Ruth. So then they're going to say Israel asked for a king right there, kind of on the edge of the end of the first millennium. And then the birth of David is going to happen in 1085 BC, and then David being anointed as king in 1023 BC, roughly 22 years of age. Now, you may not agree with that chronology, but once again, that's the main kind of ways that people look at chronology. One of the main ways that people have been influenced by chronology is from the work of James Ussher over 400 years ago. So another helpful book here would be the one by John Walton, where he has a lot of charts and whatnot. And these are just called the Charts of Old Testament Chronology, I believe is the name of the book. I got it over here on my bookshelf. I can look it up if you want to know more about it, the exact title there. But pretty much he's going to say it all really depends on where you date the Exodus as to how you date everything else, as far as what has happened since Ussher's work when scholars have tried to date the different events. So if you look here at the bottom, the United Kingdom is pretty much the same in every case. Everyone's going to say at the turn of the kind of the millennium and into the 10th century here, they're going to say that was when the United Kingdom was there, and they're going to all agree that the United Kingdom divided on the same day in 931 BC. But then notice here, if you look at these last two, they're going to say, okay, the conquest and judges all happened together over roughly a 200-year period. Compared to here on these views, you're going to have the 300 years for that, and then the wandering in the wilderness is going to have kind of its own time frame there. Then you're going to have the patriarchs being much, much sooner, and then much later, and then much later, and then much later. So, if you put the patriarchs having a lot more time, you'll kind of be in this first group all the way on the left, compared to if you don't think the patriarchs had that much time. As far as kind of when they were living, you're still going to follow the biblical chronology of how long they lived. You're not going to say that they came into existence that much earlier. But once again, this has a lot to do with how long Israel was in Egypt and when the Exodus actually happened. So many on here on the right side are going to follow a late view of the Exodus date. So they're going to say the Exodus happened sometime around 1250, sometime in the later part of that sort of century, versus these people here are going to say this all happened in the 1450 and whatnot is when the Exodus took place. So a lot of that has to do with when the Exodus could happen and what how you kind of view the text of the Exodus as far as which Pharaoh was ruler, when did they actually cross the Reed Sea. And once you've kind of determined that, everything else fits in around that event. And the same thing here is the 1931 is a set date because of other events that we use to correlate that, which is why a lot of scholars would agree that you've got to agree with the 1931. And then once you pick a date for the Exodus, everything else has to kind of fit from there.